Earlier this year, it was my night at home to cook dinner for the family, and I had a kind of craving for something a little different, something hot and spicy, a Thai green curry. And in hindsight, I should have just ordered takeaway from the local Thai restaurants, but things started out very well, at least in my mind. Things started out well. I followed the recipe that I had, and the chicken and the spices were all kind of cooking together, and the aroma was intoxicating, and my taste buds were welling. My mouth was watering with anticipation. And then it became time to eat, and things turned out very differently. Our mouths weren't watering as much as they required watering because the curry was so hot, intolerably hot. And it wasn't because I had, inadvertently made a mistake, put chili powder instead of paprika in the curry sauce. No, I didn't do that. I deliberately put chilies in the Thai green curry. But I thought these chilies were just, they're tiny little chilies. They don't have any heat in them whatsoever. So you can't just put one in. You need to put 2, 3, 4 in there. But knows to me, those chilies were hotter than I was expecting. And that dinner became intolerable for everybody in the house. So much so that every time it's Mike's turn to cook in the family home, and I kind of joke, I think it's Thai green curry night. Everyone's like, please, never again. I was reminded of 2 important truths that evening. Firstly, it doesn't matter how things start, it's how things end that is important. And the second thing that I was reminded of is that tolerance is a relative virtue, not an absolute virtue. We live in a culture and an age that really values tolerance almost above every other virtue, but it's a relative virtue, not an absolute virtue, because if the thing you are tolerating is actually causing you harm, then it's not good to tolerate it. And we see these truths in the pages of the book of Judges, and we'll see that over the next couple of months as we look through it, particularly when it comes to humanity's relationship with God. It's one thing to start out well trusting in God. It's a whole other challenge to keep on trusting in God. And second of all, it can seem reasonable and even convenient to tolerate certain beliefs or certain behaviours that maybe people around us say is harmless, but is actually dangerous to God's people. Not just to us right now, but maybe for generations to come. That will be a theme that's played out on the pages of the book of Judges. And maybe you've seen that in our current world as well. But fret not, even though in the book of Judges, there is, as we'll see in a moment, a brokenness that's so obvious, there is also hope as God is progressing his story, his plan through broken people. And we're all broken people. And so that's good news. But the book of Judges, we're told there in verse 1, it begins after the death of Joshua. Now, we studied the book of Joshua a couple of years ago, and so I can recommend you rewatch some of those sermons if you need some orientation to this period of time in biblical history. But Joshua, in summary, was the leader of God's people after Moses. Moses led the people out of slavery in Egypt, and then Joshua led the people into the promised land. He was a great leader. He was strong and courageous, and he trusted in the Lord. But now we are told, Judges chapter 1, verse 1, Joshua has died. And whenever a significant leader, both then and even still today, dies, there is almost a collective gasp. What now? Who is going to finish what Joshua has started? And so the main section of the book of Judges that we're going to look at over the next couple of months recounts different leaders or judges that lead God's people. Now, when you think of judges, think less of, men and women kind of wearing robes and funny wigs with a gavel in their hand. Think more something like an army commander. That's the type that we see often throughout the book of Judges. Not 100% of the time, there are some judges that aren't army commanders, but over and above, they seem to be more military-type leaders than they are courtroom judges. And they are anything but perfect. There are some good ones. We'll see over the next few weeks, guys like Othniel and girls like Deborah. Great. But overall, throughout the book of Judges, we see that they are anything but perfect leaders. And so we've called the series Broken, because that's an apt description of both the leaders in the book of Judges, but also the people of God at this time. And in fact, the brokenness throughout the book of Judges really spirals downwards the further you get into the book. We'll see today things start out okay, but it spirals down, down and down till you get to the end of the book. There is a sad refrain in the chapters towards the end of the book of Judges that goes like this. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did just what they wanted. It's the equivalent of the philosophy of our age, you do you. And it doesn't work today, and it didn't work all those years ago. And so the book leaves us longing for what's God going to do with these broken leaders and these broken people? Can God progress his story forward? And the answer is yes, and you'll see that by the end of the story. But like my Thai green curry, the book of Judges actually starts out okay. There is what I'm calling a faithful start for Israel in Judges chapter 1. Firstly, in verse 1, the people, after the death of Joshua, seek the Lord. Verse 1, they inquire of the Lord, who is going to lead us, who is going to go before us and fight now that Joshua is not here. They inquire of the Lord. They seek the Lord. And that's always a good thing to do. Now, we're not sure exactly what this inquiry looked like. Did they organise a collective prayer meeting and pray and ask for God's guidance? Did they have an intermediary like the priest, or did they have some other way of inquiring of the Lord's plan? We don't know how they inquired, but what's more important is that they inquired of the Lord. They recognised that he ultimately was their leader, and they needed to trust and obey him. Which leads to the second aspect of this faithful start, and that is the people obey the Lord. Because in response to their inquiry, the Lord answers and says, this is the one who is going to go before you. This is the one who is going to fight. Judah is to go. I have handed the Lord over to him. And this, just as an aside, this is quite a significant moment that Judah is chosen to lead. Because back in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, there was this prophecy or this prediction about the tribe of Judah. This is hundreds and hundreds of years before the time of the Judges, where a prophecy said, the scepter, it's a picture of reign and rule, will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet. And this is really the first time in Israel's history the tribe of Judah steps forward into leadership. It's a sign, I think, that God is progressing his plan forward, even though we'll see there is a brokenness involved. And Judah obeys. This is the aspect of the faithful start. Judah obeys, they step forward, and with the tribe of Simeon, we saw there before who they managed to somehow convince them to go and fight with them. I don't know what that conversation looked like, but Simeon goes with Judah and they fight against the Canaanites and they win. And it's a nice picture, I think, of family unity and teamwork, which is not always apparent amongst the people of God, both then or now. But there was a faithful start. And thirdly, as you look closer at verses 1 to 19, when you see God's people trust and obey, there is actually blessing to be experienced and found. And yes, we can see that immediately in verse 4, that when Judah and Simeon obey, the Lord handed the Canaanites over to them. But we also see God's blessing, I think, in some of the more unique or personal events that are recounted there in verses 1 to 19. And I want to start with that somewhat gruesome story of Adonai-Bezek in verses 5 to 7. You know, the pagan king who had his thumbs and his big toes cut off, and then he was killed or died in Jerusalem. How is that a sign of God's blessing of his people? Well, whatever questions we might have about whether that was a good thing, a right thing, or a wrong thing for the Israelite soldiers to do to their enemy, cutting off their thumbs and their big toes, and whatever we might think of how common that was in battle in the ancient world, and I recognise it does raise some ethical issues for us, but whatever issues we might have about it, did you hear how the pagan king himself saw the whole situation? His own judgment of what was happening to him. He says, God has repaid me for what I have done. God has repaid me for what I have done. He sees this event as justice coming to him. You know, I don't know whether he's boasting or not, but he says, I did the same thing, not just to one other king, but to 70. And now it's coming back in justice to me. And I think that's an important point to remember, friends. When you're reading the stories of the conquest of Canaan, either in the book of Joshua or here at the beginning in the book of Judges, it's important to remember some biblical history and theological propositions that are happening behind the scenes, because otherwise we can get confused, or we can equate what is happening now in the Middle East with what was happening back then, and they are two completely different things. Back then, this was not an ethnic cleansing, but an evil cleansing. Not an ethnic cleansing, but an evil cleansing, because theologically and historically in the Bible's time, not now, then, part of Israel's purpose in conquering the land of Canaan was to be God's instrument of justice against great evil that had been accumulating over hundreds and hundreds of years. All the way back in the time of Abraham, God had said the evil of this land will face its just deserts one day. But not now, Abraham. I want to wait till the sin of the Amorites and the Canaanites reaches their full measure, and then justice will come. God waited graciously and patiently for 400 years and more to bring about justice to that land. I think of it a bit like the flood of Noah. You know, the flood of Noah was designed to kind of cleanse the world of evil and start again. The Israelite conquest of Canaan, not now, back then, was kind of like a mini Noah flood story where God would cleanse the land of wickedness and evil, and God's people would live in peace under God's rule and blessing and display to the rest of the world what joy and blessing could be found when people live rightly under God's rule in the place that he has determined. And I think that's why there's that little mention of the beautiful story of the Kenites in verse 16. Did you notice that? These are the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, you know, Jethro, back in the book of Exodus. They aren't Jews, they're not Israelites, but we're told that they were allowed to live with Judah. They weren't forced to leave, they weren't cleansed or killed. They were welcomed and allowed to live. And I think because through the leadership of Moses, the leadership of Joshua, the leadership now of Judah, the Kenites have tasted something of the blessing of God's people living in God's place under God's rule, and they wanted to be counted among God's people, and they were welcome. And so I think here in this faithful start, there is blessing even in that weird, gruesome story of Adonai-Bezek's death, because justice is finally happening and people are being welcomed into God's kingdom who you didn't expect. But there's more. I think that wonderful story of Caleb and his daughter Achsah and her fearless husband Othniel is also a sign of God's blessing on the faithful. Othniel will later actually become one of the first judges, one of the leaders of Israel. And here we see them being faithful. They are bold, they are obedient, they trust, and as a result, they get to enjoy the blessings of the promised land. springs in the desert and land and so forth. Things start well in the book of Judges for God's people. They seek the Lord, they obey the Lord, and they receive a blessing from the Lord. But it didn't stay that way for long. It didn't stay that way for long. A faithful start had a failed ending. A faithful start had a failed ending. Have a closer look again at verse 19. Here is a verse that's kind of brimming with victory for Judah. But notice how the verse ends. The Lord was with Judah and enabled them to take possession of the hill country. Woohoo! But they could not drive out the people who were living in the valley because those people had iron chariots. The first indication that things weren't going according to plan. And then what follows in verse 21 all the way through to the end of chapter 1 is a repetition of the word failed or failure. Let me show it to you. We didn't read these verses, so let me put them up there on the screen so that you can see this repetition of failure. Verse 27, Manasseh failed to take possession of Bethshean. Verse 29, Ephraim failed to drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, Zebulun failed to drive out the residents of Kitron. Verse 31, Asher failed to drive out the residents of Sihon. Did you get the idea? Things may have started out well, but they did not end well. A faithful start became a failed ending. Why? What went wrong? They had the Lord with them. They were winning battles and victories, and then it kind of just stopped and they failed to do what they went about to do. Why couldn't they finish the job? Well, if we look closer into the narrative, I think there are two human reasons why they failed. But more importantly, when we get to chapter 2, we see things from God's perspective about why they failed. And it's a little bit different. So humanly speaking, one of the reasons they failed was because they were overwhelmed with fear. Fear. I think we see that in verse 19 with Judah. They say that they could not drive out the Canaanites in the valley because they had iron chariots. They may have had the creator of the universe on their side, but they had iron chariots. We may have had superior numbers in terms of army, but they had tanks. They had missiles and drones, and their technology and their power is so... we can't go up and fight against them. Can you see? They're overwhelmed with fear. Fear paralyzed them from completing the task. I don't know if you remember the Disney movie Frozen. Of course we all do. And the main character, Elsa, after when she was younger, accidentally hurts her little sister Anna with her frozen magic, she gets overwhelmed with fear. And she thinks the solution to not hurting anybody is to conceal, don't feel, to hide away. Be the good girl that you always have to be. I'm not going to sing the song, you know the song. But fear drove her to leave and to kind of create her own castle, and we know how that didn't go down well for her. And we know that even today, fear can be paralysing, debilitating. Fear of conflict can cause us to not have that conversation that we need to have with somebody. Whether it's our spouse, a workmate, a friend, family member, whoever it might be. Fear can stop us. Fear of rejection, particularly as a Christian, can stop us from sharing our faith with those who desperately need us to share our faith with them. Fear is a powerful human force, both then and also now. The second reason, human reason, why Israel failed is because of complacency. Complacency. And I think we see this in particular with Manasseh, who was almost described in verse 28 as a representative of Israel. Because have a look at verse 28. I know we didn't read it, so let me put it up on the screen for you as well. It's talking about Manasseh, but it says, when Israel became stronger, they made the Canaanites serve as forced labour, but never drove them out completely. You know, Israel had grown in strength. They had superior numbers. They had the power, humanly speaking, to expel the Canaanites as God told them to. But in their pride, in their success, they have decided, why destroy them when we can keep them around and get some economic benefit out of it? We can make them do the jobs that we don't want to do. They can clean the toilets and they can do whatever. You know, it's good to have free labour around. That's what they're thinking. And that is the danger of short-term success, is that it can lead to a danger of complacency. Like the Australian cricket team a couple of years ago that thought because they bowled out the Poms in their first innings for 67 runs that they had the complete Ashes test sewn up. They could put their feet up and relax. And this image of England ultimately hitting the winning runs continues to haunt me and many people around us. Complacency is a problem. It was a problem not just for Israel, but it was also a problem for the early Christian church as well. And so this is where we need to be warned about the danger of complacency. Jesus in Revelation chapter 3 condemns the Laodicean church basically for being complacent. He says they are lukewarm disciples. They are half-hearted disciples. They have grown powerful and successful. And Jesus said, you're putting your trust in your success and your wealth and not in me. And like lukewarm tea, when you take a sip, Jesus says, I want to expel you out of my mouth. And friends, complacency can be a problem in churches today, can't it? In our own Christian lives, it can be a problem. We might be super chuffed that we have recently had a victory over a certain sin that's been weighing us down in life. We're like, yes. Or we might be super chuffed that there's a particular area of ministry that we're involved with that's succeeding. And we're like, this Christian ministry stuff, this is easy. We've got this licked. And so we start to pray less. We start to tolerate more things that are ungodly because we've got it. But complacency never leads to spiritual health, whether in the nation of Israel or in the church today. And I want to suggest that at the heart of both fear on one hand and complacency on the other, although they are two distinct realities, at their heart, I want to suggest, is the same thing that causes both. Fear and complacency, at their heart, what drives them both is an unhealthy focus on your own self and ability. At the heart of both is an unhealthy focus on yourself and your ability. So the person who is overwhelmed with fear looks at their own power and ability and says, I don't compare. I can't match up. And so is overwhelmed with fear. The person who is complacent looks at themselves and thinks, I'm pretty darn good, and pats themselves on the back, not recognizing that they are as broken and powerless as everybody else. They are different realities, yes, but at their heart is a failed view of themselves or an unhealthy focus on themselves. A trust in self, ultimately over a trust in God. And then when you get to Judges chapter 2, that's exactly how God judges the situation. And so we read God speaking now, and he says this: the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land I had promised to your fathers. I also said, I will never break my covenant with you. You are not to make a covenant with the people who are living in this land, and you are to tear down their altars, but you've not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Kind of, it's almost taking us back to the Garden of Eden where God confronts Adam and Eve. What is this you have done? Where are you? Israel's failure ultimately wasn't tactical, it was spiritual. They had forgotten who their God was and what he had done. They had stopped trusting him and obeying him. And that's why I think the first thing that God says to them is, I brought you out of Egypt. Don't you remember who I am? You didn't save yourself out of Egypt. I saved you out of Egypt. I promised you this land. I have given you this land. It's not about you. It's about me and my plan and my purposes and my grace to you. We made a covenant together and it was pretty easy. I would give you the land. You just needed to trust my word and obey me. But they forgot who their God was and what he had done. The Canaanites, yes, may have had superior technology, but they were no match to the living God of the universe. The Israelites were complacent, thinking they could do things their own way, not recognizing that they were as broken as the Canaanites. Forgetfulness leads to faithlessness. Forgetfulness leads to faithlessness. And then ultimately judgment. Listen to how the angel continues. Therefore I now say, I will not drive out these people before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a trap for you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these words to all the Israelites, the people wept loudly. Israel was now becoming just like Adonai-Bezek. They will face justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, for their faithlessness. They have tolerated things that they shouldn't have tolerated, and they are now going to be thorns, traps, like buried landmines that wherever they trod, there was likely to be an explosion to cause harm to them, but not just to them. The sad reality is, because of their disobedience, their future generations will experience the same brokenness, and not just going around in circle, but spiraling downwards. No wonder they wept loudly. Now, it's tempting for us to sit here today and to think, how silly is Israel? They had God reveal himself in such a powerful way, rescuing them out of Egypt, guiding them through the wilderness, pillar of smoke and fire, and giving them the promised land and winning battle after battle. Don't they remember Jericho? How could they be so quick to forget all of that and turn their back on him? But friends, we need to be careful about that attitude. 1 Corinthians 10 says the stories of the Old Testament were written to warn us today. And so we need to hear that warning that forgetfulness can lead to faithlessness and then ultimately judgment. Forgetfulness can lead to faithlessness. But praise be to God, because he has acted for us in ways that ancient Israel could only ever imagine God could do. Oh yes, he rescued them powerfully out of Egypt, brought them to the promised land, had great hopes that they would become a new Garden of Eden for the world, and we know they never lived up to that reality. But our God has acted for us in much more majestic ways. In Jesus, we look back at a king who, like Adonai-Bezek, was killed in Jerusalem. But not for justice for his sins, but for whose? Yours and mine. Jesus died not because he was a sinner, but because he was dying for our sin, so that our faithlessness could be cleansed and we could begin anew. We could be made new. At the cross, we were released from the paralyzing burden of thinking that we need to save ourselves to be right with God. You know, if I just work harder, if I just pray harder, if I just go to church more, if I just do. At the cross, we are released from that burden of trying to save ourselves. Because Jesus says, you're broken. You can't save yourself. I'm not broken, but I'll take your brokenness so that you can know the mercy and grace and forgiveness of God. Have we not seen much more than ancient Israel? Keep going in the book of Judges. Israel had God's presence with them. Guess what? You and I don't just have God's presence with us. If we've turned and placed our trust in Jesus, we have God's presence within us. How crazy is that? That God is not just beside us, he is in us, personally guiding and directing us into all truth. We just need to remember who he is, what he's done, and who he has made us to be. I don't know if you remember the Disney movie, The Lion King, bit of a Disney theme tonight. There won't be a Disney theme through most of the other sermons, I assure you. But after Simba goes all Hakuna Matata, you do you out there in the jungle, living life the way that he thinks is best, ignoring his ultimate plan and purpose, Rafiki, what is he, a monkey or a baboon or whatever, comes to him and whacks him over the head with the staff and takes him to this pool where he initially sees a reflection of himself, but then he hears the voice of Mufasa, his father. And the voice of his father says, "You have forgotten who you are. You do you is not the plan. You are the son of the true king, the rightful ruler of the Pride Lands. You need to go back." And then there's that, you could probably hear the echo of that voice of Mufasa, remember who you are. Remember, we need to remember who we are. Remember that we are a child of the one true King who died in our place to save us, who has offered us a place in his kingdom that will never perish, spoil, or fade, who has given us his own spirit to live within us. We have every resource at our disposal to trust and obey and not forget. So remember. And just imagine what a difference that might make, even in the day-to-day reality of our Christian life, if we remember who God is, what he has done, and who we are in him. I mean, just to imagine the difference it might make to your prayer life. Imagine the renewed boldness that you could have in your prayer life when you remember who you are praying to. I love the story of Othniel and Achsah and their interaction with Caleb, the dad. Caleb is Achsah's father, and they get given this blessing, they get given this land, and Achsah turns to her new husband, Othniel, and says, "Can you ask for some springs of water too?" Now, I don't know what that conversation looked like, whether Othniel said, "He's your dad, you ask." I'm not going to ask. Anyway, she does ask boldly, and she gets given it. We have a heavenly Father who is far more abundantly gracious and generous. Just imagine if we truly believe that, how it might shape the boldness in our prayers. And I'm not saying that whatever you pray for boldly, God will give to you, but just imagine, sometimes we're so small in our prayers. Imagine if we had the boldness of Achsah, what difference it might make to our relationship with the Lord. Or imagine the new joy we might experience in the Christian life when we truly believe our God is the God who can rescue his people out of Egypt, give them the land, a God who will come in his son, the person of Jesus, die the death that we deserve, rise again to offer us eternal life, is with us now by his Spirit. If we truly believe that, we ought to be able to expect God's hand to be at work in wonderful ways that sometimes we just don't assume that he's going to do. Because we just don't believe, we think it's all about human choice and human effort. And, if we work hard, then we'll expect these results. But if we truly believe God is at work, imagine the joy. I think, I saw God do that. I saw God do that. I saw God do that. And the joy that we might experience as a result of that. If we just remember who we are, more importantly, who he is and what he has done. We live in a world, don't we, where there is a constant battle, and we are called to tolerate a whole bunch of different beliefs and behaviours that many out in the world say are harmless, but we know God's word tells us are actually harmful, and it's easy to cave in. What we must not do, Christian brother and sister, is presume to think that we know better than God's word. It's far better to be faithful now than to weep then. Remember.